In the grand, gleaming conference room of a prestigious law firm, a moment was unfolding that none of the attendees would ever forget. Maya, a black girl in her early 20s, stood confidently before a table of powerful executives and seasoned attorneys, each of them much older than her and far more experienced. It was her first real opportunity to prove herself in the world she had spent years fighting to enter, and the weight of it was not lost on her. Raised in a working-class neighborhood, where dreams often seemed like distant stars, Maya had fought for every inch of her success, graduating from law school against the odds, overcoming societal expectations, and enduring the quiet, often invisible battles that came with being a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated field. Her family, though loving and supportive, had never fully understood her determination to succeed in a world that had often turned a blind eye to her. But Maya had never allowed the challenges of her upbringing to define her. Instead, she carried the lessons of resilience, self-worth, and the unshakable belief that her voice, no matter how quiet it seemed, deserved to be heard. This particular morning, she had been invited to present her research on a complex case, a high-stakes merger that could make or break the firm's reputation. Maya had spent weeks analyzing every detail, poring over mountains of legal documents, and making sure that her analysis was not just thorough, but impeccable. She had prepared meticulously, but the nerves still crept in as she stood at the front of the room, the eyes of everyone trained on her. The room itself was intimidating: slick glass walls, leather chairs, and an air of importance that felt almost suffocating. As Maya began her presentation, her voice wavered at first, but she quickly found her rhythm, her nerves calming as she dove deeper into the details. She explained the intricacies of the merger, outlining the potential risks and rewards with clarity and precision. Her words, though carefully measured, were backed by a depth of knowledge that left no room for doubt. The room, which had been filled with skepticism and quiet judgment when she first entered, began to shift. The senior partners, who had been glancing at their watches or tapping their pens just moments before, were now leaning in, paying closer attention to every word she spoke. Maya noticed the subtle change, but she didn't let it distract her. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. However, as she moved into the final stages of her presentation, one of the senior attorneys, a man in his late 50s with a reputation for being particularly hard to impress, interrupted her. His voice was sharp, tinged with condescension. "Are you sure about this analysis, Maya? I'm not convinced you've considered the full scope of the financial implications. This is a very complex deal, and I'm not sure a fresh graduate like you can fully grasp the risks involved." The words stung, and for a moment, Maya felt a surge of heat rise to her cheeks. It wasn't just his challenge to her work, it was the implication that, despite her qualifications, she was still seen as the black girl in the room, the one whose opinion was secondary, whose ideas were not yet worthy of full respect. For a split second, she considered backing down, letting the doubt creep in, and deferring to the authority of the man who had decades of experience. But then she remembered the battles she had fought to get to this very point, the late night studying, the sacrifices her family had made for her to have this opportunity, and the promise she had made to herself to never be silenced again. Maya's eyes locked with his, and with a deep breath, she made a decision. "I understand your concern," she said, her voice calm but unwavering, "but I'm confident in the analysis I've provided. This deal, despite its complexity, can work in our favor if we proceed strategically. I've taken every factor into account: financial, legal, and ethical, and I stand by my conclusions." Her words were firm, yet respectful, carrying an authority that had not been there at the beginning of the presentation. She wasn't just speaking from the knowledge she had gained in the classroom, she was speaking from a place of lived experience, from the deep well of self-belief that had carried her through a lifetime of adversity. The room fell silent. For the first time, no one interrupted her, no one looked away. The senior attorney, who had been quick to dismiss her moments earlier, sat back in his chair, a subtle shift in his expression. The partners exchanged glances, and even the few who had once been doubtful seemed to recognize the strength in her words. Maya had done what so many people, especially women of color, were often told they couldn't. She had claimed her space, demanded her respect, and held her ground in the face of doubt. When she finished her presentation, the silence in the room was not one of hesitation but of admiration. The senior attorney, who had challenged her earlier, nodded slowly. "I stand corrected," he said, his voice no longer dismissive. "Your analysis is sound. We'll move forward with the deal as you've suggested." The room erupted in murmurs of approval, and though Maya remained composed, a wave of relief washed over her. She had not only proved herself but had also made a statement. Her value wasn't defined by her age, her race, or her gender. It was defined by her mind, her work, and her unwavering confidence. In that moment, Maya changed the room. She had shown them that she was not just a young woman with potential, but a force to be reckoned with, one whose voice would no longer be ignored. Emma Martinez had always been invisible to the world around her. As the daughter of a maid who worked in one of the wealthiest households in the city, she had learned early on to stay quiet and out of the way. Her mother, Isabel, worked tirelessly to keep the mansion spotless, serving the family with grace and dignity despite the way they often treated her like a mere shadow in the background. Emma, though young, could see the disparity. She witnessed how her mother was always polite, always respectful, yet never acknowledged for her hard work. The family that owned the mansion, the Stantons, had wealth beyond imagination, and Emma knew they considered themselves superior to the people who served them. Among the Stantons was Nathaniel Stanton, the patriarch of the family, a ruthless businessman whose name was often in the news for his multimillion-dollar deals and aggressive business tactics. He was the type of man who believed money and power made him untouchable, someone who could make or break people's lives with a single word. To him, the staff people like Emma's mother were tools to be used and discarded, mere cogs in the machine of his vast empire. Emma, though, had always been different. She wasn't afraid to question what she saw, and she had begun to feel an uneasy anger toward the way the Stantons treated her mother, as well as the other staff. She saw how they laughed at her mother's expense, how they made her work through the holidays, and how they were always so quick to belittle her, as if her mother's hard work meant nothing to them. One evening, Emma had gone to the mansion to deliver a package that her mother had asked her to take up to the main house. As she passed through the living room, she overheard a conversation between Nathaniel Stanton and a few of his guests, their voices carrying through the open door. They were laughing, but not in a jovial way. They were mocking one of the other servants, a man who had worked for the family for decades, who had just suffered a personal loss. The words that spilled from Nathaniel's mouth were cruel and dismissive. "Who cares about his problems?" he chuckled. "He's a servant. He'll get over it. They always do." Emma's heart sank. The casual cruelty in his words, the absolute disregard for another human being's pain, was too much for her to bear. She had never felt the need to speak out before. After all, who was she, a mere child, to challenge a man like Nathaniel Stanton? But that evening, something shifted inside her. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Without thinking, she walked into the room, where the group was still laughing, and stood before them. The laughter stopped instantly, and all eyes turned to her. For a moment, Emma felt small, her heart racing, but she didn't back down. "You think you're better than him?" she asked, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Nathaniel looked at her, a puzzled expression crossing his face. "Excuse me," he asked, his tone condescending. Emma didn't flinch. "You think just because you have money, you can treat people however you want. You think your wealth makes you more important than anyone else, but it doesn't. Not everyone is beneath you." Her words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the world of laughter and privilege that surrounded them. Nathaniel's guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Emma's heart was pounding, but she stood firm, knowing that this moment was something she would remember forever. Nathaniel's gaze hardened, and for a moment, Emma thought he might laugh it off or, worse, lash out. But instead, he stared at her, his face frozen in shock. No one had ever dared to speak to him like that, especially not a child. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. It was as if Emma's statement had completely taken him by surprise, leaving him momentarily speechless. The silence in the room deepened, and Emma, realizing that her point had been made, turned and walked out of the room without another word. The moment she left, the conversation picked up again, but there was an unmistakable shift. The laughter had died, replaced by an awkward quiet. Nathaniel's expression was now inscrutable, as though the force of Emma's words had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about himself and the world he inhabited. As Emma made her way back down the hallway, her mother appeared, concerned. "What happened, Emma?" she asked softly. Emma smiled, feeling a sense of pride that she couldn't quite explain. "I think I just stopped a millionaire in his tracks," she replied, the weight of the moment sinking in. The next day, Nathaniel Stanton called for a meeting with the staff. When they gathered in the main dining room, everyone was on edge, wondering what he would say. To their surprise, Nathaniel spoke not with anger, but with an uncharacteristic humility. He addressed the entire staff, acknowledging the hard work they did and the value they brought to his family's life. He even made a point of apologizing for the cruel remarks he had made the night before. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a start. Nathaniel Stanton's arrogance had been checked, not by a lawyer or a business rival, but by the simple, powerful words of a young girl who refused to let the world continue turning a blind eye to the suffering of others. Emma had done something extraordinary that day, not just for her mother, but for herself. She had found her voice and used it, showing everyone that even the smallest, most overlooked person could make a difference when they stood up for what was right. Maya stood at the back of the crowded conference room, her small figure barely visible over the rim of the long wooden table where influential figures, some of the brightest minds in the city, sat discussing the future of a multi-million-dollar development project. The room buzzed with the weight of their conversation, each word drenched in power, status, and years of experience. Maya was just 14, a child of immigrant parents who had come from humble beginnings, yet she was here, invited by her father, who had recently become a junior partner in one of the firms overseeing the project. To everyone else in the room, Maya was a mere presence, someone who was supposed to be quiet and unnoticed, a child meant to sit in the corner and observe. She had been brought along, more out of politeness than genuine expectation, yet no one had anticipated the impact she would soon make. As the discussions continued, it became clear that there was a divide among the executives about how to approach a particular issue within the project, how to integrate affordable housing into the luxury developments. The room split into two factions. One side advocated for a minimalist approach, believing that high-end condos would sell better without any compromise, while the other side pushed for inclusivity and social responsibility, wanting to ensure that the development served the broader community. The tension in the room thickened with each passing minute, voices rising, faces reddening with frustration. Maya, who had been quietly listening, could no longer contain herself. She had heard enough. With a trembling hand, she quietly pushed her chair back and walked to the center of the room, where the debate was growing more heated. The room fell silent, and every eye turned toward her. For a brief, uncomfortable moment, she felt the weight of their gazes, her small frame, her youthful face, the way her hands clenched nervously at her sides. This wasn't a place for someone like her. She could sense their judgment, their disbelief that a girl her age would dare speak. But then something shifted inside her, a quiet resolve. She had grown up listening to her parents' stories of sacrifice, of hard work, of never being heard or seen, yet always persevering. She had spent years watching them struggle to make ends meet, seeing them work tirelessly to provide for her and her younger brother. And she had always admired how her mother, despite being a soft-spoken woman, could cut through the noise with the strength of her words when it mattered. This, Maya realized, was her moment to stand tall for the people like her parents, people who had always been overlooked in the pursuit of progress. Taking a deep breath, she spoke, her voice steady but surprisingly strong for someone so young. "Excuse me," she began, the room still holding its collective breath. "I don't know much about buildings or contracts, but I do know what it's like to be told you don't matter. My family doesn't live in places like the ones you're talking about building. We live in neighborhoods where people work 2 jobs just to make rent, where families struggle to stay together because they can't afford a roof over their heads. And I know that my parents, who've sacrificed everything to give me a better life, would never get the chance to live in one of these condos you're arguing over." The room remained quiet, the weight of her words sinking in. Maya continued, her gaze unwavering, "I think you all have a chance to make something different, something that doesn't just look good on paper or in a brochure, but something that can actually change people's lives. People like my parents, people who don't have the privilege of choice. If you want this project to mean anything, then it has to be about more than just luxury. It has to be about giving people like my mom and dad a chance at a better life too." Her words hung in the air, suspended by the silence that followed. The executives, who moments ago had been locked in heated debate, were now staring at Maya in stunned silence. No one moved, no one spoke. For a moment, it seemed as if the world had stopped spinning, the power of a young girl's voice forcing them to pause, to reconsider everything they had been so certain about. Finally, one of the senior executives, a woman in her 50s known for her tough demeanor, cleared her throat. Her voice was quieter than usual, almost contemplative. "You're right," she said, her gaze now softened, her tone respectful. "We've been so focused on the numbers, on what makes the most financial sense, that we forgot about the people who are supposed to benefit from these projects." She looked around the room, and one by one, the others nodded in agreement, their faces a mix of realization and newfound respect. Maya had done the impossible, she had defied expectations, shattered assumptions, and brought a room full of powerful individuals to their senses with nothing but the truth of her words. As the discussion resumed, the tone was different. The focus shifted from mere profit to real impact, and the proposal for the development now included a substantial commitment to affordable housing. Maya had not only commanded respect, she had sparked a transformation in the way the project would move forward. Later, as they left the meeting, her father, who had been sitting quietly at the back, approached her with pride in his eyes. "You were incredible today," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You changed everything." Maya smiled, the weight of the day's events sinking in. She had spoken for herself, for her parents, and for countless others who had never been given the opportunity to be heard. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone in that room that sometimes, the most powerful voices are the ones that come from the most unexpected places. In a small, unremarkable town, nestled between the bustle of the city and the quiet stretches of farmland, there lived a young black girl named Zara who had always been told that the world wasn't meant for someone like her. From a young age, she had learned to navigate spaces that were often unwelcoming, her skin color a constant reminder of the quiet prejudice that lurked just beneath the surface. Her school was no exception, an elite institution where success was measured by grades, appearances, and the ability to blend in. Zara, however, was different. She had always carried herself with a quiet confidence that both confused and intimidated those around her. She wasn't loud, she wasn't outspoken, but there was something about her demeanor that made her presence undeniable. She was an observer, a thinker, someone who saw the world through a lens that others struggled to understand. Despite being one of only a few black students in her school, Zara never let herself be defined by her race. She had been taught from a young age that her worth wasn't tied to the color of her skin, and this belief fueled her every move. But this confidence was not without its struggles. Zara often found herself overlooked or dismissed, especially in the classroom. The teachers, though kind, were blind to the subtle biases that colored their interactions, and her peers, most of whom came from privileged backgrounds, saw her as an anomaly rather than an equal. It was at the beginning of her senior year when things began to shift. The school was preparing for its annual leadership competition, a prestigious event where students could present a project that would earn them the title of student body president. Zara, who had always quietly excelled in her studies, decided to enter, despite knowing that the odds were stacked against her. She had no intention of running for president, but there was a fire inside her, a desire to challenge the status quo, to show her peers and the faculty that a black girl from a small town could stand in front of a room full of powerful, well-spoken students and deliver something that would be remembered. Her project, titled The Unseen Voices, was a simple yet profound concept, a documentary-style exploration of how people who were often overlooked marginalized groups could contribute to society in ways that were ignored by those in power. Zara's passion for the topic was undeniable, but she knew the judges, a panel of esteemed alumni and school faculty, would expect something more polished, more acceptable. The night of the competition arrived, and Zara stood in front of a crowd that seemed a million miles away from the small classroom she had spent years in. Her heart pounded in her chest as she adjusted the microphone, the weight of the moment threatening to overwhelm her. Her classmates, many of whom had been openly dismissive of her in the past, sat in the front rows, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Zara took a deep breath, reminding herself that her presence here was not just about winning. It was about something far more important, proving that she deserved to take up space, just as much as anyone else. She began her presentation, speaking slowly and clearly, her voice steady. As she introduced her project, Zara shared powerful stories of individuals who had been silenced or erased from history: black activists, immigrant workers, queer people, and others whose contributions were often dismissed or ignored. She didn't speak in grand, theatrical tones. Instead, Zara spoke with a quiet power, allowing the weight of her words to land in the hearts of those listening. Her documentary clips played behind her, showing the faces of those often forgotten, their stories intertwining in a narrative that was both personal and collective. As Zara spoke, her confidence grew, her words flowing more freely as she realized that this wasn't just about changing the minds of her peers, it was about changing the way she saw herself. This was the moment she had been waiting for. By the time Zara reached the final point of her presentation, the room had grown completely silent. She paused for a moment, taking in the faces before her. "I'm not just standing here as a student," Zara said, her voice cutting through the silence. "I'm standing here as someone who has been told all my life that I don't belong. But I'm here because I do. We all have a place in this world, and it's time we stop letting other people define who gets to have a voice and who doesn't." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time that night, the audience wasn't looking at Zara as the other. They were looking at her as someone who had something important to say. The room erupted into applause, but it wasn't just a polite clap, it was genuine, heartfelt. Even the most skeptical students, the ones who had dismissed her before, stood up, recognizing the power in her words. Zara's project didn't win that night, but something far more significant happened. She had sparked a shift within herself and within the community that had always made her feel like an outsider. Her classmates, the same ones who had never given her a second glance, began to engage with her in ways they never had before. Teachers approached her after the event, apologizing for their past biases, acknowledging the unspoken truths in her project. Zara had done what no one thought she could do. She had used the quiet power of her confidence, her ability to stand firm in the face of adversity, to shift the perception of those around her. By simply being herself, by speaking her truth, Zara had shown her peers that confidence wasn't about being loud or forceful, it was about owning your space, your story, and your worth, regardless of how the world tried to define you. Zara's statement that night didn't just change the course of her senior year, it set the stage for a life where she would continue to use her voice and her presence to make an impact. It was a lesson in the unseen power of confidence, a quiet, steady force that had the ability to break down barriers and change everything. The grand ballroom glittered with the gleam of crystal chandeliers, the walls adorned with rich tapestries, and the air thick with the hushed murmurs of millionaires discussing business deals and charity donations. The charity gala, held by one of the wealthiest foundations in the city, was a spectacle of luxury, where the elite gathered to show off not only their wealth but their altruism. Among the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns, a young girl stood out like a flicker of light in the darkness. Her name was Sophie, and she wasn't supposed to be there. Sophie's father, a janitor at the event hall, had quietly worked behind the scenes for years, sweeping floors and emptying trash bins while the guests enjoyed their lavish evening. He was the invisible force that kept the venue running smoothly, but he wasn't part of the world inside. Sophie, however, had been invited by a volunteer who noticed her inquisitive nature and sharp mind. She had been overwhelmed by the grandeur of the evening, the fancy dresses, the diamond necklaces, and the polished silverware, worlds apart from the modest apartment she shared with her father. Yet, Sophie wasn't intimidated. She was there for a purpose, to speak up. Sophie's father had always encouraged her to be brave, to stand tall despite the world's attempts to tell her she was small. He had spent his life working tirelessly to provide for her, and although he had little to give, he had always offered the most valuable thing he could: love and encouragement. He told her that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, should ever be made to feel invisible. And Sophie had taken those words to heart. When the time came for the evening's speech, the host, a wealthy philanthropist, stepped to the podium and began to speak about the importance of charity and generosity. But just as he was wrapping up, Sophie, who had been quietly sitting in the back with her father, stood up. Her sudden movement drew the attention of the room, and every eye turned toward the young girl in her simple dress. The host hesitated, caught off guard by her presence, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. A few guests exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what was happening. "Excuse me," Sophie's voice rang out, clear and steady, despite the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her. "I have something to say." The room fell silent, and the host, though visibly uncomfortable, gestured for her to continue. Sophie's small hands clasped tightly in front of her, but her eyes shone with determination. "I've heard a lot of people tonight talk about helping others," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "About giving money to people who are struggling. But I don't think that's enough. People who are poor or invisible like my dad, like so many others, don't just need money. They need to be seen." She paused, scanning the room filled with powerful people whose influence shaped the city. "I know what it's like to be invisible. My dad spends all his time cleaning up after everyone else. He makes sure this place looks perfect, but no one ever thanks him. People like my dad work hard every day to make things better for other people, and they don't get the recognition they deserve." Sophie's words hung in the air, and she could feel the weight of the silence around her. But she didn't stop. "I'm not asking for handouts," she said, her voice now unwavering. "I'm asking for respect. For people like my dad to be seen and treated with dignity. For people who work hard but have nothing to show for it to know that they matter. Money is one thing, but kindness, real kindness, is what changes lives." At first, there was a stunned silence. The millionaires in the room, accustomed to speeches about charitable donations and grand gestures, were taken aback by the rawness of Sophie's words. This wasn't a polished, rehearsed speech. It was the truth, spoken from the heart of a child who had seen the struggle of a parent and felt the pain of being overlooked. A few moments passed before the host finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, young lady," he said, his tone more somber than before. "You've reminded us of something we've all forgotten, that it's not just about what we give, but how we see those around us." The crowd was still silent, but then, slowly, the clinking of glasses and murmurs began. Sophie had shocked them all, not just by speaking up, but by reminding them of the very humanity they often overlooked. As the night went on, many of the guests came up to her and her father, offering heartfelt apologies and thanks for the reminder. A few even promised to get involved in projects that focused on recognizing the unsung heroes in their communities, those like her father, who worked tirelessly without recognition. Sophie, for her part, smiled shyly but didn't let the attention overwhelm her. She had done what she came to do. She had made a room full of millionaires see the people they usually ignored. She had shown them that true generosity wasn't just about giving money, it was about acknowledging people's worth, regardless of their social status. When Sophie and her father left the gala that evening, her heart swelled with pride. She had made a difference, and in doing so, had reminded the world that even the smallest voice could echo the loudest. And as they walked out into the cool night, Sophie held her father's hand a little tighter, knowing that sometimes, courage came not from wealth or power, but from the belief that everyone deserved to be seen. Maria Torres had spent her entire life working as a maid in the grand, sprawling estate of billionaire magnate Alexander Pierce, an influential businessman known for his sharp mind and equally sharp tongue. For years, Maria had silently served the Pierce family, cleaning their opulent home, caring for their needs, and raising her daughter, Sophia, in the shadows of their wealth. She had long ago learned that the world she inhabited was one of power and privilege, where the lives of people like her went unnoticed, and her daughter, Sophia, was always acutely aware of this divide. Sophia, a bright-eyed, curious teenager, had grown up listening to her mother's quiet stories of working for the Pierces, and while she was proud of her mother's dedication, Sophia had always harbored a quiet dream of something more, of one day breaking the cycle that seemed destined for women like her. One day, when Sophia was 15, Alexander Pierce himself arrived at the estate for an impromptu visit, a rare occasion for the billionaire who was more often found in boardrooms than family rooms. He was known for his aloof demeanor and his disdain for what he considered lesser classes. That afternoon, Maria, as usual, was preparing the house for his arrival, setting the dining room for a luncheon meeting, while Sophia, home from school, wandered around the large house, marveling at the opulence and the stark contrast between her life and the one her employers led. She'd never felt completely at ease in such extravagant surroundings, but today, her curiosity pulled her into the formal sitting room where her mother was working. As she entered, she caught sight of Mr. Pierce seated at the head of a long, polished table, talking to his business associates. His commanding presence filled the room, and Sophia, a bit shy, took a step back to avoid being noticed. She didn't want to intrude. However, fate had a different plan. As Sophia turned to leave, she overheard Mr. Pierce say something that made her blood run cold. "It's truly remarkable, isn't it?" he was saying to a colleague. "People like that, maids, servants, have no ambition. They're content to stay in their place. Their children will always be nothing more than what their parents are. That's just how it works." Sophia stood frozen, her heart pounding as his words hung in the air, the weight of them heavier than any physical presence. It was a statement of arrogance, of complete disregard for people like her mother, and it stung with the bitterness of everything she had ever felt but never dared to vocalize. She was angry, not just for herself, but for her mother and every other person who worked tirelessly without ever being seen or appreciated. In that moment, something inside Sophia snapped. This wasn't just about her family anymore, it was about standing up to the notion that people like her were destined to remain invisible forever. She walked quietly but purposefully across the room, drawing closer to Mr. Pierce and his company. As she reached the table, she paused for just a moment to collect her thoughts. Then, with an unshakable calm, Sophia spoke. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady but firm. The room went silent. All eyes turned toward the young girl, who had just spoken out of turn in front of one of the wealthiest men in the world. Alexander Pierce's eyes narrowed as he regarded Sophia, surprised by the sudden intrusion. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice cool and condescending. Sophia didn't flinch. She stood tall, facing him head-on, a fire burning in her chest. "You're wrong about us," she said, her voice rising slightly. "My mother doesn't just clean your house. She works harder than anyone I know, and she's proud of what she does. You may think you know everything about people like us, but you don't." For a moment, no one moved, and the silence seemed to stretch on forever. Sophia could feel the weight of the billionaire's gaze upon her, but she didn't back down. "You see, it's not about ambition or whether people like my mother have a title or a fortune. It's about heart. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when no one sees it. You think my mother's life is somehow lesser because she doesn't sit at a table like this? I think the real question is, what kind of person are you if you don't see the value in people who work with their hands and their hearts?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge, as sharp as any corporate deal. Alexander Pierce blinked, taken aback by her audacity and the clarity in her eyes. He had spent his entire life believing that wealth and status were the true measures of a person's worth, that those who served had no place in shaping the future. But Sophia's words pierced through his carefully constructed worldview in a way no one else ever had. For the first time, he realized that his assumptions about people like Sophia and her mother were based not on truth, but on the narrow lens through which he had always viewed the world. He looked around the room, his colleagues now waiting for his response, and for a brief moment, he saw himself through the eyes of this young girl, someone whose life had been shaped by hard work, humility, and resilience. Slowly, Alexander Pierce stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he rose to his full height. He met Sophia's gaze, his face unreadable for a moment. Then, in a rare show of humility, he nodded. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been wrong." For a brief moment, Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She had done it, she had made him see. With that simple, unanticipated acknowledgement, something inside her shifted. Sophia hadn't just proven a billionaire wrong in one moment, she had proven that even in a world that often ignored people like her, the power of truth, dignity, and courage could change everything. Alexander Pierce may have been a man of wealth and influence, but in that single instant, Sophia showed him that true greatness was not measured by money, but by the integrity and strength of character one possessed. The room was still, and as Sophia turned to leave, she felt her mother's proud eyes on her, knowing that the world, perhaps for the first time, was beginning to understand her worth. Maya had always been the quiet one, the girl who sat in the back of the room, observing, listening, and learning. She'd grown up in a small town, where ambition was rare and dreams were often dismissed as fanciful distractions. But deep down, Maya carried a fire, an unshakable belief that her voice mattered, even if no one around her seemed to notice. At the age of 24, Maya had landed an internship at one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the country, a place where the air was thick with competition and the stakes were high. She'd worked tirelessly, pouring her heart into every task, every report, determined to prove herself worthy of the opportunities she was given. However, despite her hard work, Maya often felt invisible in the fast-paced, high-powered world she had entered. The office buzzed with the sounds of accomplished professionals, their sharp suits and louder voices drowning out hers. She watched as her colleagues, all older and more experienced, dominated meetings and made decisions that seemed to shape the company's future. The pressure to fit in was suffocating, but Maya never stopped working, never stopped hoping that one day, her chance would come. That chance arrived unexpectedly during a crucial business meeting with a high-profile client, Mr. Harrison Sinclair, a billionaire entrepreneur known for his no-nonsense attitude and his immense influence in the tech world. The meeting was designed to finalize a partnership that could secure the company's future for years to come, and the air in the conference room was electric with anticipation. Maya sat at the back of the room, taking notes as the senior partners discussed strategies, pitching ideas that ranged from impressive to impractical. Every word was carefully measured, every idea dissected with precision, and yet, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that the discussions were veering off course. The senior partners, in their efforts to impress Mr. Sinclair, were presenting ideas that, while ambitious, lacked the essential humanity that the partnership needed. They were all talking about numbers, projections, and profit margins, but no one was addressing the deeper issues that could make or break the deal. The client, Mr. Sinclair, was growing more disengaged with each passing minute. Maya could see it in his eyes. He wasn't interested in more corporate jargon. He was a man who valued authenticity, real solutions, and people who could speak the truth, not just deliver polished speeches. The atmosphere in the room grew tense, and it seemed as though the meeting was spiraling towards failure. The partners continued to pitch their ideas, oblivious to the subtle signs of Mr. Sinclair's frustration. Then, as the conversation reached its peak, Maya felt a quiet but powerful impulse rise within her. She had always been the observer, but today, something told her that if she didn't speak up now, the opportunity would slip away. Without thinking too much about the consequences, she stood up from her seat at the back of the room, her voice trembling at first but gaining strength as she continued. "Mr. Sinclair, I apologize for interrupting, but I believe we're missing something crucial," Maya said, her words cutting through the chatter. All eyes in the room turned toward her. The senior partners looked at each other in confusion, unsure whether to be offended or impressed. Mr. Sinclair, however, leaned forward, his gaze intense, waiting for her to continue. Maya took a deep breath, her heart pounding, but her conviction growing stronger. "We're so focused on the numbers, on what looks good on paper, that we've forgotten to ask the most important question: what does this deal mean for the people it affects? We're talking about growth, profits, and market shares, but none of that matters if we lose sight of the human side of business. People need to believe in what we're offering, not just see it as another transaction." The room fell silent. Maya's words hung in the air, raw and unpolished, but they carried a truth that no one in the room had dared to voice. Mr. Sinclair's eyes softened, and for the first time that day, a genuine smile spread across his face. He looked around the room, as if seeing the situation for the first time, and then, slowly, he spoke. "You're absolutely right," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've been listening to a lot of impressive figures and projections, but what's the point of all of that if we don't create something people can truly believe in?" The mood in the room shifted. The senior partners, who had initially dismissed Maya's interruption, now looked at her with a mixture of admiration and surprise. Mr. Sinclair turned to the team, asking for new ideas that would bridge the gap between profit and purpose. The meeting quickly became a collaboration, with everyone contributing ideas that focused not just on the bottom line, but on creating real value for the people involved. Maya's bold words had shifted the entire direction of the conversation. By the end of the meeting, they had crafted a partnership proposal that was not only financially sound but also rooted in values that both sides could stand behind. As Mr. Sinclair shook hands with the senior partners, he turned to Maya and gave her a nod of approval. "You did well today," he said, his voice genuine. "You reminded us all that business is about people, not just numbers." The deal was signed, and the partnership flourished. But more than that, Maya had earned her place in that room, her voice finally being heard, not as a mate of the background but as someone with a unique perspective that brought value to the table. That day, Maya learned that speaking the truth, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, has the power to change everything. It was her boldness, her honesty, and her unwavering belief in the power of human connection that had turned a sinking business meeting around and secured a future that none of them had thought possible. Sofia Garcia had always known that life wasn't about the luxuries one possessed, but about the quiet dignity with which one carried themselves through hardship. As a maid in the prestigious van der Molen estate, Sofia's days were filled with the hum of tasks: cleaning, cooking, maintaining order in the grand, opulent home that towered over the small neighborhood she lived in. Her daughter, Rosa, was her pride, a bright, curious child who had inherited her mother's quiet strength and humility. The van der Molen family, wealthy and influential, hardly paid attention to the staff that served them. But Sofia's connection to the family was more than just her work. She had been there for years, and over time, she had come to understand the intricate dynamics of the household. There was Victor van der Molen, a billionaire with a sharp mind and a sharper temper, whose business dealings seemed to stretch across continents, and whose influence in the world of finance was unparalleled. His wife, Eleanor, elegant and poised, rarely involved herself in the day-to-day operations of the estate, preferring the life of a socialite. Their son, Theo, was a charming young man in his late 20s, someone who often walked the fine line between the carefree life of wealth and the pressure of his family's expectations. Though the van der Molens were never overtly cruel, their world of excess had created a bubble in which empathy seemed like a distant, forgotten concept. Sophia, in her place at the bottom of the hierarchy, knew the world was unfair, but she had always tried to teach Rosa the importance of kindness, humility, and standing up for what was right no matter who was watching. One afternoon, the van der Molen family hosted a lavish event, a fundraiser for one of Victor's latest philanthropic projects. It was the sort of event where the elite gathered in their finest attire, making deals behind the sparkle of champagne glasses. Sophia, as always, was in the background, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Rosa, still young but growing, had been allowed to attend the event, as she often helped her mother with minor tasks, a gesture of goodwill from Eleanor who adored her for her politeness. But Rosa was not just the maid's daughter, she had a quiet, striking intelligence that surpassed most of her peers, and a presence that was both gentle and powerful. As the night wore on, something caught Rosa's attention: a small argument at the edge of the ballroom. She had wandered off from her mother's side to admire the elegant decor when she overheard Victor van der Molen speaking loudly to Theo, his voice sharp and cutting. It was clear that Theo had made some sort of business decision that Victor did not approve of, and the tension in the air was palpable. Theo stood silently, attempting to justify his actions, but his father's words grew crueler with every passing moment. "You're weak, Theo," Victor spat, his voice filled with disdain. "You'll never be able to handle the pressure of this empire. You're nothing without me." The words, harsh and biting, rang through the air, and Rosa felt a sharp pang in her chest. She had never been one to ignore injustice, and she couldn't bear the sight of a son being belittled by his father. As the argument continued, her heart swelled with an unexpected, unspoken bravery. She wasn't a child who normally spoke up in situations like this, but something about the way Victor treated his son stirred something deep within her. The ballroom was busy with laughter, music, and conversation, but in that moment, it all seemed to fade as Rosa stepped forward. She cleared her throat softly, catching both men's attention. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice trembling just slightly, "I don't think you should speak to him like that." The room fell silent. Even Victor stopped mid-sentence, his cold gaze turning to the young girl who had interrupted his tirade. There was a long pause, and in that silence, the weight of Rosa's words seemed to settle over everyone in the room. Victor's brow furrowed in disbelief, and for a moment, he seemed genuinely taken aback by the audacity of a child, a maid's daughter, no less, daring to challenge him. He opened his mouth to respond, but Rosa continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. "Everyone makes mistakes, even those who have built empires. But if you don't show kindness to the people you love, they'll never have the strength to stand on their own. No one is ever nothing, we all have something worth giving." The words were simple, but the truth in them was undeniable. Victor van der Molen, a man who had spent his life at the top of the world, surrounded by power and control, found himself struck silent, his own authority shattered by the clarity of a young girl's humble statement. For a moment, it seemed as though time had frozen in place. The room was still, and even Theo, who had been cowering under his father's harsh words, looked up at Rosa with a mixture of surprise and admiration. The silence stretched, and in that brief, breathless moment, Rosa realized the weight of her actions. She wasn't challenging the man's power or wealth, she was speaking to his humanity, calling on him to see the very thing he had lost in his pursuit of control: love, empathy, and respect. Finally, Victor looked away, his face flushed with embarrassment, and his shoulders stiffened. He cleared his throat, his voice less sharp but still filled with condescension. "That's enough," he said, dismissing Rosa as though she were a passing annoyance. But there was no denying that something had shifted in the room, and in Victor himself. His empire of wealth and influence could never offer the simple truth that Rosa had shared. He could control markets, but he couldn't control a child's integrity. As the night continued, Rosa returned to her mother's side, her heart beating with the quiet strength of someone who had just changed the course of the evening without a single intention to do so. It wasn't a grand victory, nor was it a declaration of power. It was a humble statement that had silenced a man who had built his entire life on silencing others. And in that silence, Rosa had won something far greater than any wealth or status could offer. She had reminded everyone in that room of the simple, enduring power of kindness.